Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dive into a question as old as humanity. What really lies beneath our feet? Sometimes the answer is stone and soil, but sometimes it's something no one was meant to find. Cappadocia, in the heart of Turkey, looks like a landscape dreamed up by time itself. Soft volcanic rock rises in pillars and cones, worn by wind and rain, into those strange shapes people call fairy chimneys. For thousands of years, communities carved their homes and churches into these cliffs. The idea of life within the rock isn't unusual there, and yet in 1963 something happened that felt different from anything the region had seen in a very long time. A man renovating his house knocked down a basement wall and discovered a cavity where there shouldn't have been one. Behind it was a narrow passage, cool air sliding out of the dark as if the earth were exhaling. He stepped inside and found a chamber, then another, and another still. What began as a home improvement became an entrance into a world no one in his village had set eyes on for generations. Before we step through that opening together, a quick question for you. If one sealed door beneath your city opened tomorrow, what would you hope to find, and what should stay hidden? Share your answer in the comments, and thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep exploring the worlds beneath our feet with us, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next descent. That accidental opening led to Derinkuyu, an underground city descending level after level into the earth. Archaeologists would later map out an astonishing maze of halls and rooms, stables and storage, kitchens and workshops, places of worship, schools, even communal spaces that suggest the rhythms of everyday life carried on far from sunlight. Ventilation shafts pull fresh air down into the depths. Wells provided water without returning to the surface. Massive circular doors of stone could be rolled into place from the inside to close off corridors in an instant. You can picture it. People moving through lamplit tunnels, quiet voices in spaces carved by countless hands, a city that breathes without the sky. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of people could have lived there when needed, and Derinkuyu is not alone. Cappadocia holds many such complexes, some connected by long tunnels. On the surface, the region is a study in eroded rock and open sky. Beneath, a second geography fills with planned chambers and careful engineering. It makes you pause. This is not a cave that happened to be convenient. This is something designed. That sense of design nudges a deeper memory humans have carried for a very long time. The feeling that stepping underground is stepping into another kind of reality. Long before anyone dreamed of skyscrapers and satellites, people journeyed inward, into hillsides and caverns to make art, to mourn, to speak to the divine. Torchlight flickering on the stone turned the oldest walls we know into living galleries. The ground, which holds our dead and keeps seeds through winter, came to stand for endings and beginnings at the same time. No wonder so many cultures imagined the world beneath as a realm with its own rules. In Greek thought, Hades was both a god and a place. Souls went down, not up, passing into a shadowed country beneath the living world. It wasn't fire and torment so much as a different order of being, a reflection where memory and fate behaved in unfamiliar ways. In the Hindu epics, Patala appears as a series of regions below the earth, lavish and luminous, home to beings called Nagas. Those texts describe palaces and cities in a way that reads less like metaphor and more like a travelogue of a hidden domain. Norse stories speak of Svartalfheim, the realm of subterranean smiths whose craft supplied the gods, and the Hopi tell of the ant people, who sheltered humans below ground during times when the surface was unlivable, guiding them until it was safe to emerge. Different places, different eras, recurring patterns. When people searched for language big enough for death, rebirth, refuge, knowledge, and transformation, they wrote stories that go down. The earth became a threshold. You crossed it to learn and to survive. Modern science, so confident on the surface, quietly agrees that the ground is less settled than we assume. Even today, only a fraction of Earth's subsurface has been mapped in any meaningful way. We know of cave systems that run for hundreds of miles. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky keeps surprising explorers with new passages after 2 centuries of work. Beneath the Yucatan, flooded networks extend for well over 200 miles, preserving traces of Ice Age life where light hasn't touched for ages. And those are the places we've managed to enter, instruments that peer through forest canopy and shallow ground, hint at voids and conduits we haven't reached yet. The closer we look, the more absence we discover. Spaces in the rock that suggest there's still a lot of planet left to learn. When you hold the facts of Derinkuyu alongside that larger picture, a simple renovation becomes a kind of parable. One wall comes down and history opens. Not as a ruin on a hilltop, but as a working city arranged like a careful thought. Someone planned how air would move, where water would be drawn, how families would live, where crowds could gather, how danger could be held at the threshold by doors you can still see today. The stone remembers a mind at work. Why build this way? Scholars offer practical reasons. Anatolia has seen migrations and invasions across centuries. It makes sense to imagine people retreating below during troubled times, closing those stone wheels and waiting. The region is volcanic. Living inside the rock could stabilize life through seasons of ash or extreme weather. Some suggest cycles of pressure that forced communities down for periods and back up again when conditions improved. Local traditions sometimes push the timeline further back, hinting that underground building began in response to disasters we no longer record on paper. Whatever the reasons, it's clear that entire populations were willing to move their lives into the earth, not for a single night, but for as long as it took. The idea scales outward quickly. Cappadocia is famous, but it isn't the only place where the ground has been shaped into purpose. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, you find catacombs, cisterns, quarries turned to cities, and ritual spaces carved underground. In the Andes, stories pass from one generation to the next about paths that connect temples through mountains. In Central America, caves were revered as entrances to the underworld, places rulers sought for ceremony and council. In Europe, folklore clings to old corridors beneath castles and towns, some still accessible, others bricked over and left to memory. The line between myth and archaeology gets thin in those places, and maybe that's fitting. The more we learn, the more it seems ancient people moved through the ground with intention. There's a practical side to that, of course. Rock is a good insulator. A constant cool temperature makes storage easier and living more predictable in places of harsh summer and winter. Water finds its way downward, and a well placed in the right seam turns dependence on weather into a daily habit you can trust. Light can be managed when fire is your bulb. Sound travels differently underground. A whisper can carry along a curved passage in a way that a shout on the surface never will. The elements change their behavior under stone, and smart builders took advantage of that. But beyond the practical, there is the feeling. If you've ever stepped into a deep cave and turned your light off, you know it. The dark down there is not the dark of night. It's a darkness with weight. Your ears pick up small things. Your breathing sounds bigger than it is. The world contracts and deepens at the same time. It's easy to imagine why people believed knowledge lived there, or why a community might choose that steadiness in uncertain times. An underground city isn't just a bunker. It's a decision to rearrange life around a different sky. It helps to remember how the rock itself made this possible. The tuff and other volcanic layers in Cappadocia are relatively soft when first worked, then harden with exposure. That means you can carve space with simple tools and have it hold shape for a very long time. Centuries, even millennia, if you're careful about the structure you leave behind. The landscape gave a gift, and people accepted it with patience and skill. Level after level, room after room, the city grew where light could not go. It also helps to remember that underground building is hard to date with precision. Organic material decays, written records get lost, later residents expand or modify earlier work. Some complexes seem to have been used across long stretches of time by different cultures for different purposes. That's another reason these places pull on the imagination. They carry layers of human decision without the tidy captions we sometimes wish for. A kitchen remains a kitchen when you can see a hearth. A school is harder to label unless you find a bench on a wall where a teacher once scratched letters that survive. Much of what we know about how these cities were used comes from comparing spaces, reading tool marks, and following the logic of water, smoke, and crowd flow. Even with that caution, certain features speak loudly. Those round stone doors rolled into place from inside are not ambiguous. They announce worry about what might come down a corridor uninvited. Long, narrow passages that open abruptly into broader rooms keep defenders safer than strangers. Ventilation shafts that reach down through levels prove that air was more than an afterthought. A well within the walls is independence. Taken together, the design hints at a life that could be sustained completely below, not just a brief refuge between attacks. It is worth pausing on a gentler image too, because underground cities are not only about siege. Imagine the steady rhythm of a day there, the warmth of ovens and the smell of bread. Children's games in a wide hallway carved smooth by generations of feet. A gathering place where songs echo longer than usual because the ceiling curves just so. A small shrine lit by flame. Laughter that wraps around a bend, carrying farther than you expect. The underground is not inevitably grim. For many, it was simply home for a season, or home for good. From this vantage, myths begin to feel less distant from stone. A Greek might have thought of a realm of shades while descending to a family tomb. A priest-king in Mesoamerica might have spoken to ancestors in a cave where cool air condensed on skin like breath. A Norse craftsman telling stories by fire could have believed skill itself was a gift from those who laboured under rock. A Hopi elder recounting the ant people would remember a narrative of survival that honours guidance in the dark. When you hold those stories next to the engineering of a place like Derinkuyu, you don't need to choose between poetry and practicality. They can sit beside one another comfortably, and yet the scale of our ignorance remains the loudest voice in the room. We still do not know how many such places exist. We still do not know how far some of those long tunnels once reached before collapse or closure. We still do not know all the reasons people retreated below, or how often those retreats lasted a generation instead of a week. Every new survey brings surprises. Every blocked passage suggests a chapter unopened. The map of the subsurface is a fraction of the world it represents, and that fraction keeps expanding at its own stubborn pace. All of this brings us back to the opening question: what really lies beneath our feet? In Cappadocia, the answer turned out to be a city sleeping behind a wall, a city that changed how people thought about the region, and, in a quieter way, how we think about the human story. The surprise wasn't just the depth or the number of rooms. It was the realization that a whole way of life can hide in plain sight, sealed by a little stone and a lot of time waiting for someone to swing a hammer in the right place. There are stories from other parts of the world about tunnels that run farther than anyone expected. Corridors you can follow until the air thins and your lamp warns you to turn back. Some are folklore. Some are archaeological notes from an era before modern methods, half remembered in journals and local histories. They all share that same edge of possibility, that lines drawn beneath the earth connected places we now consider separate, that the ground held roots for trade, escape, or pilgrimage that left few surface traces. Until we map more, they remain what they are, suggestive, worth thinking about, a reason to keep looking. Maybe that's the most honest way to end the first steps of this journey. The underground invites bold guesses, but it rewards patience. Derinkuyu doesn't shout an answer, it opens a door. It reminds us that geology can be architecture, that myth can be memory, and that history sometimes prefers the quiet. When you add up the ruins we know, the stories we tell, and the anomalies our instruments keep turning up, you get a feeling you can't quite shake. We may not be the first to walk these lands the way we do now, so we'll keep to a simple, worthy question as we go deeper. What if beneath us lies not just geology, but history? Chapters of it, entire sections pressed into stone and left intact. And if that is even partly true, what happens when we begin to read? Because if a man with a sledgehammer can bring down one wall and find a city, there's no telling what the earth is still holding a few feet further on. If you feel like we opened a door, this will feel like a step inside, the moment our eyes adjust to the deeper light. Now that we know entire cities have been carved into rock, it's time to take in the wider landscape underground. Some of it human-made, some natural, all of it reminding us that the world below has always been larger than we imagined. Here we have something vast and unarguable. In the rolling hills of Kentucky, Mammoth Cave winds on for hundreds of miles. Passages braid and rejoin, drop away and rise again, so long that new sections still turn up after generations of mapping. It is not a city, but it teaches a simple, humbling lesson. The ground can hold labyrinths on a scale that laughs at our surface maps. You can walk for hours and still feel you have only traced the outline of a much bigger shape. When people tell stories about long tunnels and hidden networks, it is worth remembering that the stone is already full of pathways, even before a single tool touches it. Human hands, though, have been busy underground for a very long time. The rock-hewn churches and homes of Cappadocia sit at one end of a spectrum that stretches across continents. In the Maltese Islands, the Epogum of Hal Saflieni descends in carefully curved chambers cut into limestone, a three-level complex used for burials and ritual across many centuries. There are graceful architectural touches down there, carved features that echo forms seen in above-ground temples, suggesting that the builders were not merely carving voids, but making spaces with intention and memory. The walls still carry traces of red ochre. In one small chamber celebrated for its voice, a single tone lingers and folds back upon itself in a way listeners do not soon forget. Whatever we think those spaces were for day to day, the effect is unmistakable. Someone shaped the earth to carry sound, light, and feeling in particular ways. Far across the Atlantic outside modern Mexico City, Teotihuacan rises toward the sky with a geometry that has puzzled and impressed visitors for centuries. Beneath the surface, a different geometry runs underfoot. Tunnels were found beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, their walls dusted with sparkling minerals and their floors hiding pools of liquid mercury. The mercury is difficult to handle and dangerous to breathe around, hardly an obvious choice unless it meant something to the people who placed it there. Some see a symbolic underworld, a mirror river for a city that traced the heavens in stone above. Whatever the meaning, the fact remains. The builders of Teotihuacan reached down as deliberately as they reached up. Move east again, and the story changes flavour but keeps its theme. In Rome, kilometres of catacombs thread the soft tufa outside the city walls, galleries of the dead carefully arranged, marked and revisited. In Istanbul, an underground forest of columns holds up the basilica cistern, turning water storage into an architecture of long reflection. In India, the rock-cut caves of Ajanta and Ellora turn faces of stone hills into art and prayer, colonnades and sanctuaries hewn inward instead of raised in blocks. These are not all cities in the sense of Derinkuyu, but together they show a human habit. When surface life grows crowded, hot, dry, dangerous or sacred enough, we take our cleverness below. We solve practical needs, water, temperature, safety, and we also make places for memory, ritual and beauty. Natural spaces keep up their side of the conversation. In northern Mexico, the Cave of the Crystals at Naka glows with columns of selenite grown to improbable size, some longer than a bus, formed in a pocket of heat and mineral-rich water that stayed stable for ages. To step into that chamber is to feel the earth practicing its slow, patient craft. The conditions down there are harsh, hot, wet and taxing. But the lesson is plain. The underground is not just the absence of light. It is a workshop where geology works in a different tempo. People who dwell beneath inherit some of that rhythm. Food stores better. Daily temperatures flatten out. Sound behaves differently. Time itself seems to lengthen. Back in Cappadocia, the subterranean network stretches beyond a single city. Derinkuyu has neighbours. Kaymaklı, Özkonak, and many others perforate the region. Long corridors, some known, some suspected, reach between them. On the surface, villages sit like islands in a sea of stone. Beneath, roots braid communities together through passages sized for people, carts, and animals. Whatever the exact dates for each phase of digging, the cumulative picture is one of organised planning. Not just refuge in a pinch, but a system that could manage air, water, food, and movement for many thousands. When you think of ancient infrastructure, you might picture roads and aqueducts in open air. It is interesting to consider the underground as a comparable network, quieter, better hidden, and resilient in its own way. It is easy to list examples and lose the thread, so it helps to ask what they share. First, an understanding of materials. Limestone, tufa, and volcanic tuff can be carved when fresh and hold shape as they dry. Builders in Malta, Rome, Cappadocia, and countless quarry towns learned the particular moods of their rock the way a sailor reads water. Second, a sensitivity to air and water. Breath has to move, and water has to be trusted. Where the stone was too tight, shafts were sunk to draw light and flow from above. Where the stone leaked, plaster and design compensated. Third, a way of thinking about space that is different from building on a flat plane. Underground plans are not just two-dimensional, they are stacked and threaded, full of choices about where to turn weight into strength and where to leave it hollow. There is also the matter of scale. It is one thing to carve a tomb or a shrine. It is another to arrange life so that entire neighborhoods can vanish from view for weeks, months, or seasons. You need food storage, cooking spaces, waste control, places to gather, places to sleep. You need a way to care for the sick and teach the young. You need to handle smoke and humidity, to keep wells clean, to keep passages from collapsing as generations adjust them. These problems have to be solved in advance, or the consequences arrive fast. The success of places like Derinkuyu implies a tradition of practice. Knowledge passed down in gestures and rules of thumb. Cut here, never there. Leave this rib, open that shaft. Listen for this change in the hammer. It is the kind of wisdom that accrues slowly, written not in text, but in the memory of hands. Outside the human story, modern science keeps pointing to a planet that is busier below than we once thought. Great aquifers store water beneath deserts and plains, slow rivers beneath the rivers we see. In the mantle, minerals stabilize water within their crystal lattices, so that an ocean's worth, maybe more, exists as bound molecules far below our feet. Seismic studies trace zones where the rock partly melts and moves differently, slow tides in a sea of stone. None of that maps to a simple corridor we can walk, but it contributes to a picture of interior complexity. If nature provides voids, channels, and stable conditions, it is not surprising that people explore them, make use of them, and sometimes decide to live there for a while. Stories layer onto this geology. Across Asia, legends of hidden kingdoms beneath mountains talk about Shambhala, or places like it, not as holes in the ground, but as sanctuaries of wisdom in hard times. In more recent esoteric writing, names like Agartha gather associations, a reminder that the underground is as much a canvas for the imagination as it is a practical address. It is wise to separate literature from archaeology, but it is also fair to notice the persistence of the theme. When cultures speak of refuge, endurance, or secret knowledge, they point down as often as up. Meanwhile, the archaeological record keeps whispering in details. In Malta's Hypogeum, the footprint of rooms and thresholds suggests controlled movement, the sense that people were meant to proceed in a certain order, to gather where sound changes, to turn where sight lines open. In Teotihuacan's tunnels, minerals that glitter like starlight catch torch glow the way a careful designer might hope. In Istanbul's cistern, the sound of dripping water under a forest of columns turns storage into a kind of ritual in itself. No single feature proves a grand thesis. Taken together, they hint at an ancient habit of shaping the underground to speak in symbols as well as utilities. Not every buried place is sacred, but many carry signatures of meaning. Practical use and symbolism sometimes mix so closely they are hard to pull apart. Consider temperature. Underground rooms hold steady at a cool range through hot summers and cold winters. That is useful for food and comfortable for sleep. It also makes a space feel otherworldly to people used to the surface's constant shifting. Consider darkness. It protects and conceals. It also sharpens hearing and smell, focuses attention, and lends weight to ritual. Consider water. Wells mean safety. Water also marks transitions in story and rite. When ancient builders carved their way inward, they brought all of these layers with them. None of this requires us to assume secret empires humming behind every hillside. The point is simpler and, in a way, more interesting. For thousands of years, people have looked at the Earth not only as something to build upon, but as something to build within. Sometimes because they had to. Sometimes because it made sense. Sometimes because the feeling of being under stone answered a need they couldn't have met any other way. From Kentucky's endless chambers to Malta's quiet steppes, from Teotihuacan's glittering corridors to Cappadocia's mile-long links, the underground is a continent of choices. There is a historical rhythm to those choices too. In periods of turmoil, the record of carved refuges increases. In periods of prosperity, subterranean work turns towards storage, water, and ceremony. The same skill set is applied like a toolkit to different pressures. If invaders threaten, tunnels constrict and doors grow heavier. If droughts come, cisterns multiply and channels take on more thought. If faith flourishes, acoustics and light are tuned like instruments. You can read a community's changing fortunes in the angles of its stairs and the wideness of its rooms. One more thread belongs in this tapestry: continuity. Underground spaces once made invite reuse. A quarry becomes a shelter, then a chapel, then a crypt, then a wine cellar, then a museum hallway for curious visitors. Each layer leaves a trace. The underground is where a city's long memory gathers because it is difficult to erase. Fire does less harm, wind does nothing at all. Sunlight cannot fade what it never touches. That is why archaeologists, when allowed, love subsurface layers. They hold on to small things: a footprint in dust that hardened, a scratch on a wall, a bit of plaster that still bears a fingertip's curve. If you stack all of these observations, natural spaces far larger than intuition, human skill applied inward as readily as outward, utilities braided with symbols, a planet laced with water and heat below, you arrive at a reasonable curiosity. When ancient builders looked around at their options, did they simply use caves and cut chambers as stopgaps, or did they also see opportunity? Opportunity to outlast bad seasons, opportunity to hide knowledge from casual destruction, opportunity to test ideas in controlled environments. Even the most conservative reading of the evidence leaves room for those possibilities. We arrive at a quieter question than the one we began with, perhaps a sharper one. If the Earth offers miles of ready-made halls and the materials that carve cleanly, if communities across time have already left us cisterns, catacombs, sanctuaries and cities layered beneath our daily roots, what precisely were they building for? Survival alone explains much of it. It may not explain all of it. There are rooms tuned to voice, corridors dressed to glow, doors designed to welcome some and refuse others. Practical, yes, but carrying a hint that something more was being protected, whether that meant sacred rites, treasured objects, or hard-won knowledge about living well when the surface did not. It is worth thinking about that as we go deeper. Perhaps the underground was a shelter first and a secret second, or perhaps the two were always one and the same. If danger comes from above, the safest place to keep what matters most is below, carved into a world that keeps its own counsel, and if that is true, then the next natural step is to ask what kinds of things people thought were worth guarding in the dark. Were they storing grain and water and tools, stories and teachings, maps and measures, or something we have not yet learned to recognize? That is where the trail leads, toward evidence that is stranger, toward anomalies that sit just a little outside our expectations, toward spaces where the practical and the mysterious shake hands. The builders who went below solved problems we can understand. They might also have left marks we do not yet know how to read, which brings us to the doorstep of the next layer in the story, where pattern gives way to puzzle, and the ground begins to answer back in more than one voice. Stories often arrive before measurements do. Long before survey ropes and laser scanners traced corridors in stone, people were already telling one another that the ground opened into other realms. They spoke of refugees beneath mountains, of kingdoms under rivers, of teachers who lived where sunlight cannot reach. Even now, when we hear of a city discovered behind a wall, the older voices stir. It's as if the tales were waiting for proof to wander by. Across the world, the language changes, but the pattern holds. Descent, trial, counsel, return, or sometimes no return at all. In Greece, the underworld was not merely a metaphor for death. It was mapped in imagination with the care given to any province. Rivers had names: Styx, Acheron, Lethe, and thresholds were guarded. Heroes like Odysseus, Orpheus, and later Aeneas made their way down not to end their stories but to continue them. They went to ask questions, they went to meet the dead, they went to carry something back. The direction of the wisdom in those tales is downward first. Travel east and the scenery changes without losing depth. In the Hindu epics and Puranas, Patala is described as a set of realms beneath the earth, glowing with jewels and lit without sunlight, home to the Nagas, serpentine beings associated with knowledge, wealth and power. The texts give details that feel strikingly concrete: palaces, gardens, measures. They do not treat Patala like a symbol to be decoded later. They describe it as a place with its own rules. The king of the Nagas, sometimes named Vasuki, coils beneath mountains. Shesha, the cosmic serpent, supports the worlds. In such images you can hear a people thinking with the earth itself, imagining stability as a living coil and hidden places as seats of council. Northward, in the Norse cosmos, one of the 9 worlds is Svartalfheim, the home of dwarves and dark elves, renowned for their craft. Legendary weapons and treasures, Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor, Gungnir, the spear of Odin, are said to come from their forges. The association is persistent. Precision and mastery belong to those who dwell under rock. When a people thinks of its most durable tools, it sends them through a door in the mountain and credits their making to neighbours who prefer shadow to sun. On the far side of the world, the Hopi tell of the ant people, beings who, in times of fire and flood, took humanity below and showed them how to live until the surface was safe again. In that telling, descent is not punishment but rescue. The underground is not a grave, but a womb. There is a small architectural echo in Hopi kivas, the ceremonial chambers entered from above by ladder. A hole called the sipapu marks the place of emergence, a remembrance of coming up from below. You can stand beside a sipapu today, look down into the little portal, and feel a memory sharpen without needing to explain it away. Mesoamerican traditions add their own roots. The Maya speak of Xibalba, an underworld reached through caves and water-filled sinkholes. The hero twins in the Popol Vuh descend to face trials set by lords of that realm. They outwit death with patience and cleverness, before rising again to become the sun and the moon. To the Aztecs, Mictlan lies in the north. The journey there requires crossing rivers and enduring cold winds. And there is the origin story of Chikomostok, the place of 7 caves, from which ancestral peoples emerged. The landscape cooperates with these memories. In the Yucatan, cenotes open like eye sockets into limestone, and offerings recovered from their depths tell of reverence and fear. In the highlands, caves bear soot from fires and soothed walls from hands. Across the sea, Irish lore has the Tuatha De Danann, a race of brilliant, powerful beings who, when displaced, do not sail away or perish. They go into the Seed, the Mounds. There they remain as the Aussie, the people of the Mounds, neighbours encountered at thresholds. In these stories, the Underhill world runs parallel to ours, accessible at certain times of year, or to those who know the right path. Ireland's landscape is strewn with barrows and ring forts. Whether or not particular mounds ever held doors, the idea that wisdom and wonder might be inside the hill became part of how people understood their place. Japan remembers Yomi, the land of the dead, entered in myth by Izanagi in search of Izanami. The tale warns against looking back and portrays the underworld as a realm where the living should not tarry. The entrance to Yomi is associated in tradition with a cave in Izumo. To stand at such a mouth is to feel again the chill of a threshold. In Mesopotamia, Inanna, or Ishtar, makes a descent through 7 gates to the realm of Ereshkigal, setting aside a symbol of power at each doorway until she stands bare before her sister. The price of returning is terrible, and marks the living world with cycles of loss and new growth. Descent stories teach by sending us down and bringing us home transformed. Persia adds a note that sounds almost like instruction. In the Avestan texts of Zoroastrian tradition, Yima, Jamshid, is commanded to build a vara, an enclosure to shelter plants, animals and people from a deadly winter sent by an evil force. The description includes layers, provisions, and light. Some later interpretations imagine it underground, sealed and kept, a survival vault long before that phrase existed. Whether or not we should read the Vara as literal, it fits with the theme we've already felt, that a wise response to a harsh season is to take what matters most below and keep it until the world can be trusted again. Even the Greeks, who were so detailed about Hades, made room for sanctuary rather than only sorrow in their caves. The oracle of Trophonius at Lebedea required petitioners to descend into a chthonic chamber. Those who emerged were said to be shaken, sobered, changed. The earth, in this telling, does not just receive the dead, it advises the living. If you needed an answer that the daylight could not supply, you went down. Look at these strands together and a pattern starts to resolve. Not a single picture, but a family resemblance. Again and again, the way into knowledge, safety or renewal is marked as downward. Teachers appear who are not exactly human. Serpents who rule in jewelled halls, smiths in caverns, people like ants whose generosity sustains a future. Trials take place in darkness. Initiations happen where the air is still. Emerging afterward is not simply walking up a ladder. It is a new social life. You return with different obligations and different eyes. It helps to notice how closely these stories hug the geography that carries them. Regions rich in limestone and caves produce myths where thresholds are literal, where you can point to a mouth and say, "That is where the ancestors went." Places of volcanic stone recall chambers that keep a steady temperature through the seasons, and so their narratives speak of endurance. Islands with burial mounds and passage graves teach their children to think of the dead as neighbours under the hill. In every case, the ground shapes the imagination, and the imagination replies by shaping behaviour. At the same time, the similarities reach beyond geology. The idea that knowledge may be hidden for safekeeping appears in traditions with very different landscapes. So does the motif of a guide, someone or something that knows the way when the lights go out. Virgil leads Dante in a poem from a much later age. A spirit guide leads a shaman into the deep. Names and costumes change, but the sequence remains recognizable. Invitation or necessity, crossing, ordeal, counsel, return. If you strip away the details, you find a structure that seems to belong to the way humans learn from danger. You can hear skeptics and believers arguing at this point, and maybe both have something worth hearing. One voice says, "Of course these stories arise. Humans are everywhere. Caves are common. Death is universal, and descent mimics sleep, winter, and the seed." Another voice asks, why do details line up so often? Why do we get rulers under mountains, vaults to shelter life, teachers with non-human forms, entrances that are given exact locations? Maybe the mind simply prefers certain shapes. Maybe memory lives in places longer than we expect. It is sensible to hold both thoughts at once and let time test them. What stands out is how often underworld tales carry instructions for living. They don't only explain what happens after death, they advise how to behave while alive. Loyalty matters. Ask Orpheus. Courage matters. Ask the hero twins. The right timing matters. Ask anyone who tried to pry open a seasonal door when the calendar did not consent. And reverence matters, particularly for thresholds. You do not linger or shout at a mouth in the rock. You ask, you wait, you accept. There are also clear traces of social memory tucked within the fabric of myth. Floods, fires, and winters too long for comfort appear in many traditions. The solutions are practical in the oldest sense. Gather seed, keep animals, choose companions wisely, store light. The place where you do those things is often below. Whether or not a particular people ever tunneled the way Cappadocian masons did, their stories suggest that the idea of going into the earth to save what you love has been on our minds for a very long time. The meeting with non-human beings is worth lingering on for a moment, because it recurs with surprising consistency. Serpents in India, dwarves in Scandinavia, ant-like helpers in the American Southwest, lords in feathered masks in the Maya lowlands, shining folk under mounds in Ireland. Each culture dresses its neighbours differently, but the neighbours share two qualities. They are powerful, and they have specialised knowledge. Metallurgy, agriculture, healing, the reading of stars. Such skills are often said to come from those who dwell out of sight. Perhaps that is simply a way to honour the mystery inside every craft. Perhaps it also remembers a time when teachers did in fact prefer a quieter address. Not every descent returns good news. The underworld can be a place of no return, a reminder to respect boundaries. In Japan, Izanagi's look backward seals a separation. In Sumer, Inanna's return requires another to take her place. Cycles are costly, and balance is kept with exact payment. The Maya hero twins succeed, but only after playing by the rules of a harder court. These darker turns protect the stories from becoming travel brochures. They keep them from being spoiled by overuse. If you go down, go for a reason. If you are invited, be grateful. If you are warned, listen. Through all of this, caves and tunnels and mounds remain more than scenery. They are the stage on which transformation happens. Initiation rites take place in chambers where sound folds and light behaves like a liquid. Ancestors are spoken to in spaces that force a person to slow down and breathe with care. Offerings are given to water that sits where daylight cannot reach. You can call these settings convenient or symbolic. Either way, they are chosen for their effect. They make the body participate in the lesson. It is tempting to separate myths into boxes. This one poetic, that one historical, but the edges blur when you get close. A people chooses a cave for ceremony because their story says it is a doorway. After enough generations, the path to that cave is worn. The soot on the ceiling grows thick, and an archaeologist stepping inside can say with confidence, something important happened here, again and again. The story shaped the place. The place preserved the story. Later readers can argue about which came first, but the pair is what matters. So the question rises in a different form than it started. Instead of asking whether these tales are true, in the way we usually use that word, we might ask what kind of truth they carry. If a culture remembers refuge under the ground, and builds shrines that reenact emergence, and tells children about helpers who live in the dark, then those narratives are teaching survival and humility. If a culture honours smiths and imagines their best work coming from neighbours beneath the mountain, then those narratives are teaching respect for skill and patience. If a culture marks mounds as entrances and treats certain nights as doors, then those narratives are teaching attention to time, place, and promise. And still, the old whisper remains. Maybe some stories are closer to memory than we let ourselves say out loud. Maybe the pattern of down for counsel, up for change, was learned in more than dreams. We don't have to decide today. What we can do is let the echoes guide our eyes. When the next chamber appears on a scanner, when a tunnel is cleared and a draft brushes the face, when a ladder leads to a room with a ceiling blackened by centuries of flame, we can remember that countless people before us already imagined such places and placed their hopes there. It's worth noticing too how these tales prepare us for what stone sometimes reveals. A city carved into soft rock with doors that roll shut from within. Stories of refuge make that less surprising. A corridor in Mexico dressed to glitter like a night sky and ending in a pool of metal. Stories of mirrored rivers below the world make that feel familiar. A complex in Malta shaped so that a single voice turns to chorus. Stories of council in chambers underfoot make that effect seem chosen rather than accidental. You don't need myth to appreciate a site, but you might need it to notice what a site is trying to say. In the end, the ground and the story do what they have always done. They meet at the threshold. People step down, sometimes to hide, sometimes to learn, sometimes to listen. They return with gifts, or they do not return. They tell what they can, and their children fold the details into epics and prayers. Centuries pass. A wall comes down in a modern house, and a wind from a forgotten hallway moves across a man's face. He raises a light and peers in. Somewhere, a very old line of words feels newly at home. We are left with a question that is gentle and persistent. Are these tales simply the way human beings make sense of fear and change, dressing winter and death and skill in the clothes of serpents and smiths and mounds? Or do they carry in their careful repetitions a memory of times when going below was not just a lesson but an address, when the earth itself kept teachers and cities and stores of life? Perhaps the answer is not one or the other. Perhaps story and stone have been nodding to each other all along. Either way, the next steps lead from story back to the ground, to places where air moves in surprising ways, where walls are cut with care, where darkness is arranged to do something more than hide. If the old accounts invited us to look down with respect, the sites themselves will ask us to notice what doesn't quite fit the usual explanations. The pieces that make you stop and say, quietly, that is interesting, worth thinking about. And that is where we turn next, toward evidence that sits just to the side of the expected, patient as ever beneath our feet. Some places underground refuse ordinary labels. The stone is cut with a deliberateness that feels like thought. Proportions nudge the breath into a slower rhythm. Sound behaves as if the walls themselves were part of the conversation. The practical needs are visible: air, water, storage, safety. But something else runs alongside them. A room answers a voice. A corridor glitters like night. A passage narrows or bends at a point where meaning seems to gather. These are not accidents that happen to be useful. They are arrangements. On Malta, the Halsaflieni Hypogeum descends through limestone in a sequence of chambers carved with calm precision. The curves and niches echo above-ground architecture without merely copying it. as if a grammar of thresholds and sanctuaries had been translated into the earth. Traces of red ochre still cling to sections of wall. A small chamber, often called the oracle room, has a strong low-frequency resonance. A single held note in that range returns with a presence larger than the voice that produced it. Whatever the chamber's daily function, the stone was shaped in a way that makes breath participate. In a world without electricity, that is a kind of instrument. High in the Peruvian Andes, the ceremonial centre at Chavindehuantar developed where mountain ridges and converging rivers already gave the site a natural emphasis. Beneath plazas and terraces runs a network of galleries. The plan guides movement in deliberate stages, alternating compression and release, darkness and limited light. A granite monolith, the Lanzon, stands in a cruciform chamber, encountered at close quarters. Conch shell trumpets found on site can produce tones that fill those passages with sound that seems to arrive from everywhere at once. Stone channels beneath certain rooms could be opened to send water surging underfoot. Taken together, these features create a sequence that manages attention. The galleries shelter bodies, but they also orchestrate perception. At Teotihuacan, northeast of modern Mexico City, geometry organizes the surface, but the most surprising evidence sits below. Excavation of a sealed tunnel under the Temple of the Feathered Serpent revealed walls dusted with minerals that scatter torchlight like stars and spherical objects whose pyrite coatings once gave them a cold shimmer. At the deepest point, pools of liquid mercury were found, difficult to obtain, hazardous to handle, and unlikely to appear by chance. Interpretations differ. A symbolic underworld river, a tangible counterpart to the celestial order above, is one reasonable reading. Whatever the meaning, the facts persist. Materials were selected for how they behave in the dark, and a second world was constructed beneath the first. Elsewhere around the Mediterranean, the ground holds quieter statements. The Basilica Cistern in Istanbul arranges a forest of columns for the single purpose of storing water, and yet the effect is contemplative rather than merely functional. On the Giza Plateau, bedrock is cut with shafts and chambers that embed the monumental surface architecture into the earth below. A deep stepped shaft west of the Sphinx reaches groundwater. Across Malta, shallow parallel grooves known as cart ruts run toward and into the sea, raising questions about repeated heavy movement and method. These examples do not all belong to sanctuaries, but together they show a habit of thinking with the ground as much as with the sky. Measurements sometimes catch what the eye alone does not. Certain subterranean rooms favour narrow bands of frequency so strongly that a spoken tone seems to gather mass. In other places, localized magnetic variations make instruments hesitate. Stone type and mineral content matter. Limestone carries sound differently than basalt, and iron-rich seams can influence a compass. Explanations should be careful. It is enough to say that builders paid attention to effects, tested them, and kept what worked. When a room amplifies a voice, it is reasonable to see intent rather than coincidence preserved by luck. Not every anomaly sits underground, but some surface sites matter because of what they imply about capacity. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey presents rings of T-shaped pillars carved with animals and deliberately buried after long use, reaching back into the 10th millennium BC. Çatalhöyük, not far away in time, shows dense settlement without streets, roof entries, walls renewed across generations, and interiors marked by ritual. Neither is a city beneath a hill, yet both demonstrate organization, surplus, and coordination at scales earlier than many models once allowed. If those capacities existed above ground, applying similar ambition to the rock below should not be treated as an outlandish idea when the need or the belief was present. The hypogeum's resonance has encouraged studies of psychoacoustics because the effect is simple and repeatable. A low male register sustains and swells, claims that a single magic frequency produces specific states drift beyond what the data can bear. But anyone who has sung a single note under a stone vault knows how architecture can multiply a voice. The point here is modest. Someone carved a chamber that cooperates with breath, and the result is memorable enough to become part of how the place is understood. Chavin's galleries demonstrate a different vocabulary. Proportion, darkness, echo, vibration, and sequence act together. The feeling that the mountain itself has a voice arises without elaborate devices. Whether astronomical cues influence the plan remains debated. What is observable is that water, sound, and light were managed in concert. That makes the complex useful as a key for reading other sites. If a corridor narrows suddenly, if a ceiling drops to a certain height before a figure appears, if a tone seems to arrive from nowhere, those are design choices with psychological consequences. The tunnel at Teotihuacan offers yet another approach. Materials selected because they transform torchlight. Minerals become stars, Mercury becomes a river where there is none. A visitor enacts a narrative in steps. Above, a broad avenue draws the eye toward the horizon. Below, a confined path gathers the night into reach. Cosmology is not only spoken or carved, it is walked. The choice to create a mirror world underground suggests a desire to make order tangible when the sky cannot be trusted to speak plainly to everyone. Smaller cues add texture to this pattern. Narrow shafts in some subterranean contexts admit a blade of light at a predictable moment each year, turning a wall into a calendar that keeps its appointments in darkness. Spiral stairs cut to the left or to the right favour one arm over another in a way that reveals thought for defence. Long corridors join communities across terrain where surface travel would be conspicuous or exposed. Each feature has an immediate use. Each also hints at layers of meaning that carry beyond the moment. The ordinary users of the underground help draw a baseline. Cool rooms preserve grain and wine. Ice houses save winter for summer. Cisterns steady a city against drought. Quarries become shelters, then chapels, then museum passages. Those functions explain much of what stone holds. They do not explain why a chamber is tuned for voice, why a tunnel ends in Mercury, or why a sanctuary sits precisely where a shaft of light will find it on a narrow window of the calendar. Where effects exceed utility, another intention is usually present. Claims that leap to hidden machines or perfect energies do not help. They make careful reading harder. The work here is simpler and more demanding. Stay with what the places themselves can show, accept the strangeness they already offer, and let that strangeness guide interpretation. A room that turns one voice into many implies attention to listening. A gallery that uses water and echo to unsettle and instruct implies a pedagogy of place. A tunnel dressed to resemble the night implies cosmology enacted as movement. None of those require inventions. Each rests on observations any visitor can make. The question that surfaces is not whether these sites were useful. They clearly were. The question is what else they were doing at the same time. Calendars set into dark interiors keep agricultural time without relying on clear horizons. Controlled acoustics focus a group and signal ceremony in a way no written sign can match. Corridors that rise and fall in fixed sequences pace a body toward readiness for whatever is kept at the end. These are tools for memory, discipline, and continuity. They preserve patterns through stretches when writing is sparse, and when a shared experience carries further than a carved inscription. Consider what might have been guarded in such places. Rules for planting set against a reliable wall of light. Stories that require a hush and the echo of a particular chamber to carry their weight. Measures and ratios tested under shelter so wind and weather cannot distort them. Agreements renewed in a room that makes every oath sound larger than the person speaking it. The contents are not listed. The architecture suggests their existence. A thread runs through all of this. Function and meaning braided tightly enough that they are hard to pull apart. Storage and safety are present, yet the choice of proportion, material, and sequence insists on more. These are spaces that steadied communities and taught them at the same time. Power is at work, but not the kind that needs wires. It travels by ritual, by the tug of a note that gathers strength, by the shimmer of pyrite in the right light, by the way a narrow passage slows the feet and clears the mind. Where measurements report acoustic anomalies or magnetic quirks, the safest response is not to declare a secret technology, or to wave them away as quirks of geology. It is to recognize that ancient makers learned the moods of stone by long attention, and turned those moods to their purposes. The ground is not inert in these places, it acts. Builders noticed, and they built with that in mind. Gather the examples, Malta's carved resonance and careful curves, Chavin's galleries that choreograph experience, Teotihuacan's mirror cosmos beneath the plaza, cisterns and shafts that marry utility to atmosphere. calendars that keep their promises in the dark. The list does not resolve into a single claim. It suggests an outlook, a way of working with Earth that treats it as partner and archive. When destruction comes from weather, war, or time, what is kept below survives more often and more quietly than what stands in the open. The path from here leads toward evidence of another kind. Findings from modern instruments that look through stone and return shapes we did not expect, and discoveries that life itself thrives far below the reach of sunlight. The stones speak first, and they have said enough to justify attention. The next voices belong to the tools that extend our senses and to the living systems that make their own rules underground, widening the mystery rather than closing it. Tools have begun to do underground what telescopes did for the night sky. Extend our senses, return patterns where we once saw only darkness, and hand us more questions than answers. Rock turns out to be less of a wall and more of a veil. When it lifts, even a little, familiar ground looks different. A gentle rain of particles falls through us and everything around us at all hours. They are called muons, born high in the atmosphere when cosmic rays strike air. Most of the time they pass unnoticed. With patient detectors, though, their paths become a kind of X-ray for stone. Denser rock stops more of them. Empty space lets more through. The pattern that reaches a detector can be inverted into a picture of what lies between. In 2017 AD, a collaboration at Giza used this approach and reported a large void above the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid, a space perhaps 30 meters long that had not been charted in modern times. In 2023 AD, the same project revealed a previously hidden corridor near the north face entrance, about 9 feet by 6 feet and several yards long, sealed since antiquity, and accessed with a small camera only after imaging hinted it was there. A void is not the same as a decorated room with a story we can read, but it is not nothing. It says the interior is more layered than the old diagrams suggest. Muon radiography is not limited to monuments. Volcanoes have been mapped this way to trace conduits of magma and pockets of gas. Tunnels and industrial cavities can be located through meters of overburden. The signal is slow and subtle, more like a long exposure than a snapshot, but patience is a fair trade when light cannot be brought inside. As techniques sharpen, so does the picture. Large spaces stand out first. Smaller ones wait for better statistics and better geometry. The lesson is steady. The underground answers signal with shape if you give it time. Sound tells its own story. Seismology began with earthquakes and has grown into a way of reading the planet's interior. Waves generated by quakes spread through the Earth, refracting and reflecting as they pass through materials of different stiffness and temperature. From many such paths, three-dimensional models can be assembled. Tomography on a planetary scale. These maps show thickened routes beneath mountain belts, slow zones where rock is hotter or partially molten, slabs of old seafloor that have sunk deep and still hold together, and, near the base of the mantle, regions with unusual properties that gather under Africa and the Pacific. None of this is a tunnel you can walk through. It matters because it reminds us that the subsurface is complicated at every scale. There are voids and conduits in limestone a person can enter, caverns big enough to fly a drone in, aquifers that behave like slow rivers, and then vast structures we can only infer. The ground breathes and swallows, transports heat and water, and stores the record of ancient collisions. Any story about what people did below has to fit into that living architecture. Water threads through the picture. Beneath deserts and plains lie aquifers with capacities measured in centuries of local rain. In karst country, water sculpts a second geography of shafts and galleries, sometimes linking valleys that look separate on a surface map. Deeper still, minerals in the mantle lock hydrogen and oxygen into their structure, a reminder that water underground is not always liquid, but sometimes a component of stone under crushing pressure. On human scales, the presence of predictable coolness and dependable moisture made underground building attractive. On geologic scales, the movement of water changes the rock itself, carving futures no one at the surface can see. Another branch of inquiry looks not for space, but for life. In South African gold mines, kilometers below ground, microscopic communities have been found living off the chemistry that arises when radioactive decay splits water and freeze the energy to build cells. The species catalogue grows stranger the farther down the list goes. Bacteria that never meet sunlight, archaea that metabolize metals, organisms that sleep in crystal lattices of salt for years and then wake when water returns. The Deep Carbon Observatory's decade of work offered a conservative estimate of biomass locked in the subsurface that dwarfs our intuition. Tens of petagrams of carbon, hundreds of times the carbon mass of all humans combined. This does not make the underground a green jungle. It makes it a slow, spacious pantry of persistence. If life can maintain itself so far from photosynthesis, it is easier to take seriously the idea that communities understood how to borrow some of that steadiness for their own survival above and below. Drilling adds a different kind of testimony. The Kola super deep borehole in Russia reached more than 7 miles down before heat and pressure made further progress uneconomical. The core samples did not yield a neat list of exotic secrets. They returned something more useful: proof that preconceptions are brittle. Water turned up locked in crystalline structures where none had been expected. Rock behaved plastically at depths where it had been assumed to be brittle. Microscopic fossils appeared in layers thought too deep to carry them. The moral was not that everything we thought was wrong, but that the living Earth resists simple summaries. Every layer holds surprises. Remote sensing from above lends an extra set of eyes. LIDAR, which uses pulses of laser light, strips away vegetation in its data to reveal subtle surface features. Ancient causeways, embankments, and low mounds that had been hiding in plain sight in jungles and forests. While it does not look through solid rock, it outlines the canopy-mast entrances to cave systems and sinkholes, and shows how past populations organised their lives around them. Thermal imagery has a narrower role, but in some contexts nighttime temperature patterns hint at shallow features. Buried walls hold heat differently than soil. Cavities change the way the ground cools. Each tool has limits. Each contributes clues when used with care. Closer to the scale of rooms and corridors, ground-penetrating radar sends radio waves into the first several meters of the subsurface and reads reflections where materials change. It has found tombs, voids under floors, and the outlines of walls beneath plazas. Magnetometry records variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by fired clay, stone, and disturbed soil. The results map old building lines and pits without a shovel. Electrical resistivity, which measures how easily current flows through the ground, complements these methods by highlighting wet versus dry zones and voids. None of these should be treated as oracles. Interpretation requires ground truth, the careful small excavation that confirms what the instruments suggest. But the combined effect is undeniable. Much more is visible now than a generation ago, and the map of the near subsurface is filling in with lines that would have been guesses before. These methods have a habit of reframing old places. The hidden corridor in the Great Pyramid was not dreamt up. It was the intersection of physics and persistence. In other heritage sites, radar reveals earlier construction under later floors, a palimpsest of lives in one address. At some mounds and tells, magnetometry teases out the street grid of a vanished town without turning a single clod. In a few cases, imaging has warned against a careless trench, by showing that a feature continues beyond the first impression, saving a history from unintentional harm. Mystery in this context is not romantic fog. It is a way of describing how much there is to learn when you have better tools and a little restraint. Claims circulate that every mountain hides organised space, that neat halls run beneath entire ranges. The strongest maps do not show that. What they show are crustal roots, where rock thickens under the weight of peaks, fractures where fluids move and sometimes carry ore, caverns where geology allows, ice caves under volcanoes where heat sculpts hollows in the frozen surface, and, under some ice sheets, lakes sealed away for tens of thousands of years, Lake Vostok in Antarctica being the most famous example. These are remarkable on their own terms. They do not need exaggeration to feel large. When the language is careful, respect grows. There is another layer to the modern picture, and it belongs to archives as much as instruments. Old field notes, aerial photographs taken before reservoirs were built, and survey drawings done by hand have been digitized and combined with new data. Patterns appear that no single method could show. A line of shallow depressions across farmland turns out, under lidar and magnetometry together to be the ghost of a Roman aqueduct. A scatter of cave entrances resolves, with hydrological models and dye tracing, into a drainage network feeding a spring that supplied a city for centuries. In this way, the mystery is not the enemy of knowledge. It is the invitation to fit pieces into a shape that holds. What do all these tools say about human spaces hidden by time? They say that interpretation needs patience and a willingness to separate empty from silent. A void in a pyramid is a result to be honoured, not a storyline to be forced. A low-density zone under a hill could be a natural pocket, a quarry, a burial gallery, or something we have not seen before. The first duty is to record the fact cleanly. The second is to test hypotheses against what can be observed without injuring the site. The third is to accept that some answers may remain out of reach until methods improve. That last step is harder now, in an age that expects a reveal every few minutes, but the places we care about have already waited a long time. They can wait for us to understand them on their own terms. The deep biosphere changes the mood of the whole conversation. Knowing that life thrives on radiolysis in darkness, that microbes form communities kilometers down in rock pores, that methane and hydrogen cycles run without sunlight, reframes the underground as an ecological space, not just a geological one. It suggests a continuity between natural and human persistence. Where rock grants steadiness, life finds a way to persist. Where communities sought steadiness, they may have learned, by trial and error, to take on a few of the underground's habits. Regulate temperature, shield what must not be disturbed, reduce dependence on the day's weather, store what matters in places the wind cannot reach. Not all recent findings are dramatic. Some of the most useful are small. Drones suited for narrow spaces can now survey sections of caves too dangerous for people, stitching together high-resolution models. Portable spectrometers rid mineral fingerprints on walls without scraping a sample. Micro-CT scanners let researchers examine the structure of deposits and artifacts from inside out without cutting. These incremental improvements add up to a different kind of intimacy with places we can barely enter. Familiar rooms become legible in new ways. All of this feeds a modest, persistent thought. The map beneath us is only beginning to take shape. Years ago, lidar rewrote what we thought we knew about some forested civilizations by revealing that isolated temples were in fact parts of vast urban mosaics. A similar shift is underway for the subsurface, though it will be slower and in many ways quieter. There will be new corridors and chambers. Yes, there will also be patterns of water, of airflow, of acoustics, of alignments that connect sites across distance and time, not by conspiracy, but by the shared logic of what the ground allows and people desire. Science in this story is not the skeptic who turns the lights on and banishes mystery. It is the lantern with a better wick. Each new method extends the conversation with the earth by a step. Muons trace density and whisper where stone gives way to space. Seismic waves read deep structure. Radar and magnetometry sketch the near field. Drones and scanners let us walk without risk where we should not tread. Biology tells us that life is more patient than we imagined. The result is not a solved puzzle. It is a richer landscape of questions. A few of those questions sit close to the heart of this series. When imaging shows a void where no void was expected, what criteria distinguish a natural pocket from a human intention? When acoustics in a chamber carry a narrow band so strongly you feel it in your ribs, is that a fortunate accident adopted into ritual, or the residue of long testing until the desired effect arrived? When a corridor ends in materials chosen for how they alter light, what sort of knowledge was being made tangible for the people who walked there? And when the map grows to include many such places, does a pattern emerge of communities using the underground not simply to hide, but to teach and to keep? The answers will not arrive in a single paper or a single season. They will come as they have been coming, one carefully measured signal at a time, one excavation that opens a door without harming the house, one drone flight through a passage too fragile for a boot print, one microbial genome pieced together from a litre of groundwater taken a kilometre down. Each makes the underground less abstract and, paradoxically, more remarkable. What started for many of us as a curiosity about a city behind a wall is now a conversation with a planet that keeps revealing how layered it is. If there are human stories tucked into those layers, rooms that still carry a purpose, corridors that still sing their single note, vaults that still remember a blade of solstice light, that is not something science will flatten. It is something science will help us find without breaking. And the more we find, the more the old question returns, less as a provocation and more as a steady invitation. How much of our story is still underground, and how carefully can we learn to read it? Not every doorway below is meant for tourists. Some have ticket windows and timed entries, others have steel gates and guards. A few have nothing at all, just a blank patch of rock where the entrance used to be. The reasons vary: conservation, safety ownership, geopolitics, sacredness. What they have in common is simple. The deeper the passage, the fewer people are allowed to walk it. Preservation is the first explanation most site stewards will give, and it is not an empty word. Human breath carries moisture and carbon dioxide. Both can stain, soften, or feed growth on stone. A handful of famous caves have learned that the hard way. When too many visitors stand in a chamber, a microclimate shifts and fragile surfaces react. That is why places like Lascaux and Chauvet in France are kept closed, and faithful replicas host the public instead. In Malta, the hypogeum limits numbers sharply and controls air and humidity. It is not about secrecy, it is about time. A chamber that lasted for millennia can unravel in a decade if the balance is wrong. Hazard is the second reason. Some spaces below are simply hostile to unprotected bodies. The Cave of the Crystals at Nacre is an extreme case. Heat and humidity so high that early scientific teams had to work in short shifts with cooling systems to avoid collapse. Other sites hold air that stales fast, pockets of carbon dioxide heavier than the air you need to breathe, or radon that builds in stillness. Tunnels can flood without warning. Unstable ceilings don't always announce themselves until they fall. Even where access is allowed, sections are often roped off because a few centimetres of crumbly floor stand between a visitor and a drop no one should test. A different kind of gate stands at the line between archaeology and public curiosity. Excavation and imaging at heritage sites are managed by permits, ethics boards, and national laws. Teams often publish drawings and measurements while holding back specifics that could aid looters or encourage reckless entry. Coordinates are rounded. Sensitive features are generalized on public maps. In some countries, official policy requires that any non-invasive scanning at major monuments be reviewed before results are released, not to suppress findings, but to keep interpretation from outrunning evidence or stirring damage on the ground. When new corridors are detected, like the voids and small passage imaged in the Great Pyramid, access follows a long chain of approvals, tooling, and conservation planning. The pace can feel like stone itself, but it is meant to protect what cannot be replaced. There are also places below that are protected not for what they hold, but for what they mean. Some caves are living ceremonial sites. Certain mounds and chambers are tied to prayers, burials, or community obligations that continue into the present. Guardianship in those cases belongs to descendants and practitioners, not to the general public. Maps may be incomplete on purpose. Photos may be discouraged or forbidden. Story carries responsibility, and the setting is part of the story. Restricted can be another word for respected. Beyond preservation and ritual, the modern world's infrastructure makes its own demands. States build command centers under mountains. Cities run transit and utilities through bedrock. Data centers retreat into old mines. Seed banks sleep in Arctic rock where the ground keeps a steady cold. None of that is rumour. Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado houses well-known defense facilities. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is exactly what it sounds like. A cold, dry archive for crop diversity should the surface world falter. Helsinki has an official master plan for what it puts under granite. Traffic links, reservoirs, sports halls, even a church, spaces that free the streets above and shelter the city when it needs it. Other nations have carved networks for strategic forces and civil defence. These are not hidden kingdoms. They are the practical arrangements of a species that plans for disruptions and prefers to keep certain functions out of harm's way. Rumours flourish where access ends. A door is locked. A story grows. Some claims remain rumours for good reasons. Tales of giant skeletons found in caves appear again and again without verifiable context. Reports of global tunnels running with geometric regularity beneath entire continents arrive without maps that withstand scrutiny. A few sites, like the pyramids in Bosnia, attract attention. and counterclaims in equal measure, with archaeologists and geologists disputing the very premise, while enthusiastic volunteers dig on. In the Amazon, remote sensing has transformed our picture of past urbanism by revealing causeways, earthworks, and settlements hidden by canopy, but talk of vast engineered tunnel networks beneath the forest floor remains far ahead of fieldwork. In these spaces between caution and certainty, it helps to hold two thoughts at once. Absence of access is not proof of what some hope to find. It is also not proof that nothing is there. Security adds another layer of opacity. Some underground morphology intersects with borders, bases, or critical infrastructure. A cave system that reaches a protected perimeter can go from hiking curiosity to off-limits overnight. A tunnel discovered near a sensitive site will be mapped, sealed, and put in a folder the public will not see. In other cases, authorities worry about simple human risk: lost tourists, thrill seekers, and amateur explorers who underestimate a crawl and need rescue in rooms with no signal. Restrictions can be blunt tools. They are also the tools on hand. There is a quieter form of restriction that does not involve fences. Researchers sometimes keep precise locations of fragile finds out of papers so that looters cannot arrive with shovels the morning after publication. Landowners who host important features on private property may allow controlled study and ask that the world not learn the access point. Descendant communities may share information conditionally. Knowledge passes to those who will care for a place, not to those who would turn it into content. In all of these cases, the map becomes a patchwork, detailed in some squares, blank in others by design. If this sounds like a story of closed doors, it is also a story of careful openings. Many heritage managers are experimenting with ways to show what must not be stepped on. High-resolution scans, photogrammetry that lets you walk a space on a screen, measured drawings released as public resources. Some create replicas beside the original, as at Chauvet and Lascaux, so the wall that cannot breathe our air can still be seen. Others run limited tours with strict quotas, as in the Hypogeum, or rotate access so wear is spread thinly. It is not the same as standing in the original, it is the price of letting the original stand. The question that shadows all of this is a simple one. Are doors closed because there is nothing to see, or because what is there is not ready for every eye? The truest answer is plural. Some spaces are sealed because stone shifts and cannot be trusted. Some are sealed because a wall painting will bloom with fungi if thousands of breaths touch it each month. Some are sealed because they sit under a runway or alongside a secure tunnel. Some are sealed because a prayer is still being said there and a line must be kept. And yes, some are sealed because mapping is incomplete, interpretation is fragile, and stewards would rather wait than announce a story they will have to retract. It is easy to be impatient with that caution. It is harder to imagine the regret of opening too soon. Think of the ancient pigment that flakes when humidity spikes, the footprint that crumbles under a boot, the collapse that follows a vibration no one accounted for. Below ground, mistakes last a long time. Waiting, in that context, is not indifference, it is strategy. And yet the feeling persists, the sense that the deepest parts of the human record are more seen than shared. Part of that is romance. Part of it is the real shape of knowledge as it moves, slowly, with blind corners, often gated by money, law, and expertise. If there are caches of teaching kept below, ritual forms, calendars set into stone, methods for surviving bad seasons, they are unlikely to be laid out in a press release. They are more likely to be read in the architecture itself when the light is right and the conditions are gentle. So the path forward holds two disciplines at once. One is patience with the people who guard entrances, because most of the time they are protecting what all of us hope to learn. The other is attention, because the patterns we have already seen, rooms tuned for voice, corridors arranged to teach, calendars that keep their appointments in darkness, suggest that the story below has never been only about refuge. It has also been about knowledge kept steady where wind and fashion do not reach. Some doors will open, some will stay closed, some will be replaced by careful copies, and some will be pointed to in a footnote that says simply, "Location withheld." That does not end the mystery, it sharpens it. If the earth holds chapters of our story that have been read only by a few, the work now is to ensure that when we do read them, we do not tear the pages loose. There is a question that keeps returning, no matter how many chambers we map or corridors we clear. What if the most enduring chapter of our story isn't on the surface at all? The evidence we've touched, cities carved into rock, galleries tuned to voice, tunnels arranged like a second map beneath the first, doesn't insist on a single answer. It does, however, make one possibility feel worth holding in the mind: that people have repeatedly turned to the underground not only to endure hard seasons, but to carry knowledge forward when the world above was uncertain. Think of the cycles remembered in so many traditions: floods that reset whole landscapes, winters that outlast memory, fires that blacken the horizon. In the archaeological record, there are moments when organisation arrives earlier than our old models allowed, when communities show they could coordinate labour, plan for generations, and build with a precision that still reads clearly in stone. If those capacities existed, then retreating below during crises would not require a leap into fantasy. It would follow naturally from a sober reading of risk. Close the circular doors, follow the cool air, keep the grain where weather cannot reach it. Wait. That word, wait, may be the thread that ties the practical to the imaginative. Waiting changes what a community values. You need ways to keep time without horizons. You need rooms that hold attention when you can't count on sunlight to set the day. You need calendars that work in darkness and agreements that don't blow away in a storm. The places we've visited suggest answers. Walls that catch a blade of light on a narrow window of the year. Chambers that make one voice sound like many. Corridors that step the body through a sequence until it is ready to receive what's kept at the end. Survival and teaching fold into one gesture. The myths keep pace with that idea. A people comes up from caves when the surface is safe. Serpentine teachers counsel beneath palaces of stone. Smiths under mountains provide what the world above needs but cannot yet make. Ancestors live under mounds and are visited with offerings and respect. Even when these stories are clearly symbolic, they carry habits that would help any community poised between retreat and return. Honour thresholds, pay attention to seasons, learn the land's inner roots, hold knowledge where it isn't easily disturbed. None of this proves that a vast unified civilization moved underground and stayed there for millennia. The record does not offer a blueprint for a hidden empire. What it does offer, again and again, is a picture of societies that use the earth as partner and archive. In some regions, that meant refuge for weeks or months in troubled eras. In others, it meant generations weaving life below into ordinary time. And if a few communities chose never to undo the habit, if a valley's people decided that steadiness under stone was preferable to a surface that kept changing, that choice would leave traces much like the ones we see. Engineered air, defended passages, sanctuaries that double as schools. Modern instruments are beginning to overlap with the old intuitions. Muon imaging outlines spaces where drawings showed none. Radar reads a floor and whispers that it is hollow beneath. Seismic maps remind us that voids and conduits are part of the planet's grammar, not exceptions to it. Biology adds a subtler layer. Life thrives in deep, slow ways without sunlight, so the concept of a sustainable below-ground existence is not an invention of fiction. It is a fact of the Earth, even if most of that life is microscopic. The closer our tools get to seeing clearly, the more the underground looks less like an absence, and more like a fabric with its own logic. If that fabric holds human threads we have not yet followed, the question becomes ethical as much as technical. How do we look without harming? How do we walk carefully in rooms that have already lasted longer than our languages? How do we balance curiosity with the obligations that come when a place is still part of a living tradition? Caution will always frustrate those who want a headline. But below ground, a careless step is a permanent sentence. Patience is not the enemy of discovery. It is the price of keeping what we find. The idea that something, books without paper, tools without rust, instructions laid into stone, awaits in places we have not yet connected is attractive, and it should be approached with the same steadiness we've been practicing. For every corridor that ends in Mercury, there will be 10 that end in storage. For every chamber tuned for voice, there will be a dozen that simply hold a harvest. The wonder is not diminished by that ratio, it is made credible. When meaning shows up where function alone would have sufficed, it stands out for what it is, a deliberate choice to keep more than food and water safe. It is also worth asking what civilization means in this context. The word conjures empires and borders on a map. Underground work suggests a different scale. A network of towns that share methods may be more realistic than a single capital issuing orders. The continuity could be cultural rather than political, a way of cutting stone, of pacing ceremonies, of correlating a star with a planting rule, of designing doors that welcome some and refuse others. Those continuities travel farther than laws and last longer than walls. As for the idea that descendants of such communities might persist below, cousins who kept to a steadier climate while we rebuilt above, that is a thought to hold lightly. It sits between hope and story. There are no names we can responsibly supply, no maps to follow, no dates to circle. What we can say is that the underground is hospitable to patience. A culture that prized continuity over conquest could find in stone the conditions it prefers. If we ever do open a door that reveals neighbours rather than ruins, the moment will be less about vindication and more about the care with which we introduce ourselves. The horizon for discovery is changing whether we are ready or not. Imaging sharpens, drilling reaches deeper, remote platforms can linger where feet should not. Artificial intelligence helps sift patterns across datasets that used to sit in separate rooms. The same tools that can flatten subtlety in careless hands can protect subtlety in careful ones. They can tell us where not to dig, when to leave air still, which corridor should remain a picture on a screen rather than a doorway on a weekend. Used well, they will let us learn more while losing less. All of this leads to a plain, durable thought. The ground is not only a stage for our buildings, it is a collaborator in the ways we remember and survive. When people stepped down into stone to make a life, they were not turning away from the world. They were choosing a version of it that holds steady long enough to carry what matters across a rough passage. The engineering is impressive. The restraint is too. To carve a room that sings, then use it for a purpose and leave it intact for those who come after, that is a kind of generosity. If there is a civilization beneath us, maybe it is not a single nation in the dark, but a habit of mind, to set instructions in places wind cannot reach, to anchor calendars where clouds do not interfere, to let forms teach when words fail, to accept the Earth's slower tempo when the surface runs too fast. By that measure, the traces already in hand belong to it. They are quiet, they are careful, they still work, so we end where we began, with a simple invitation to keep looking with respect. When a scanner reports a hollow where none was expected, when a draft brushes the face from a blocked passage, when a chamber returns a tone that stays in the ribs longer than it should, we can remember that the deepest parts of our story may prefer silence to spectacle. They are not hiding from us, they are waiting for us to learn how to listen. And if the true outline of our history is pressed into the earth rather than written on its surface, then perhaps we have only just begun to scratch it. Thank you for watching.